I caught my mom with another man and she made me keep quiet. Now everyone thinks I helped her cheat. I was 12 years old, curled up on the couch with a blanket pulled over my shoulders and a high fever that made everything feel distant and unreal, when everything in my life quietly, permanently collapsed. It was supposed to be an ordinary school day, but I had woken up with chills and a pounding head, and my dad, rushing to work, told me to stay home and rest. He assumed my mom would be up soon to check on me, but she wasn't. She had come home late the night before from what she called a work party, her voice thick with laughter and vodka, and that morning she was still passed out in the bedroom with the door shut and the blinds drawn tight. She didn't know I was there, didn't know I was sick, didn't know I was awake and listening when her phone buzzed on the nightstand and I, curious and bored, wandered in to grab it. She didn't know that was the moment I would read something I would never unsee. I had just come out of the bathroom, still shivering, wiping sweat from my forehead with the sleeve of my pajama shirt, when I heard the front door open and the low murmur of voices, one of them my mother's, the other a man's voice I didn't recognize. At first I thought maybe it was one of my father's friends or a neighbor stopping by, but then I heard laughter, soft and flirtatious, and something in me froze. I peeked around the hallway corner, heart pounding, and saw them step into the living room, my mother and a man I had never seen before. They were talking about dinner plans, about a place they liked going to, and the familiarity in their tone made it clear this wasn't their first conversation. Then, without hesitation, he leaned in and kissed her, right there in our living room, in the space where we opened Christmas presents and watched movies as a family. I stood completely still, not sure if I was awake or dreaming, the fever making everything feel hazy, but that image burned itself into my memory with terrifying clarity. Terrified and confused, I slipped behind the sofa, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I crouched there, barely breathing, as I watched my mother embrace the man with a kind of closeness that didn't belong to strangers, the kind of tenderness that should have been reserved for my father. They kissed right there in the living room, the same space where we had once sat together to decorate the tree, where I had unwrapped birthday gifts and fallen asleep during movie nights. I felt paralyzed, burning up from the fever but frozen by what I was seeing, unable to make sense of how something so familiar could suddenly feel so wrong. Then, without even a glance around, they made their way upstairs, toward the bedroom that was supposed to be my parents'. I stayed hidden, the weight of what I'd witnessed sinking in slowly, settling into a part of me that I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. At some point, I must have made a sound, maybe I shifted too loudly or breathed too hard, because suddenly she turned and her eyes locked on mine. For a split second, her face was a mixture of shock and something close to fear, but it changed almost instantly, tightening into something cold and sharp. She rushed over, grabbed my arm with a force that startled me, and crouched down to my level, her voice low but laced with urgency. She told me I shouldn't have been home, that I had no idea what I thought I saw, and then, more quietly but more chillingly, she said that if I told anyone, especially Dad, it would be my fault when he left, that I would destroy our family, that everything would fall apart because of me. I stared at her, sick and shivering, my head spinning, unable to speak. In that moment, she wasn't my mother. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize, someone who was asking me to carry a secret far too heavy for a 12-year-old to bear. After the threats and the panic faded from her face, she shifted again as if flipping a switch, and suddenly she was gentle, almost tender, brushing my hair back and speaking in a soft voice like none of it had just happened. She asked if I wanted ice cream and led me to the kitchen like everything was normal, like I hadn't just seen the entire shape of my world tilt sideways. She sat across from me at the table, slid a bowl in front of me and called it a one-time mistake, something she said she deeply regretted and swore would never happen again. She told me she needed my help to protect our family, that I was old enough to understand how complicated adults could be, that I was mature for my age and because of that I could be her ally, her secret keeper. And I was a child, I wanted to believe her, I wanted to believe my family wouldn't fall apart, that things could go back to the way they were. So I nodded and I kept the secret, not out of strength or understanding, but because I was too young to realize what it was doing to me. I kept that secret buried deep through all my teenage years, carrying it like a quiet, invisible weight that shaped everything without anyone noticing. Anytime I so much as hinted at the memory, through a question, a look, even just a prolonged silence, she would react instantly, either breaking down in tears, yelling until her voice cracked, or swinging the other way with gifts and sweet words, as if she could erase it with distractions. It created this endless cycle of confusion, guilt, and manipulation, where I never quite knew which version of her I'd get. I started doing anything I could to stay away from the house. Joining clubs, working late shifts, staying at friends' places under the excuse of study groups or sleepovers. I filled every free hour with noise, people, movement, anything that would keep me from being alone with her, or worse, with the memory of that day that never really left me no matter how hard I tried to forget. I never told anyone, not my friends, not my therapist during a brief, half-hearted attempt at counseling in high school, and not even Michael, the one person I should have trusted with everything. We met in college, both of us wide-eyed and a little broken in our own quiet ways, and something about the way he listened, the way he showed up for me without question, made it easy to fall in love. We moved in together after graduation, got married a year later, and I let myself believe that the past had finally been left behind, that what I had carried for so long no longer had power over the life I was building. But I was wrong. The silence I had wrapped around myself didn't disappear with love or time. It just waited, growing heavier, shaping the way I flinched at certain questions, the way I avoided visiting home, the way I froze every time someone mentioned trust. I thought I had buried it deep enough. I didn't realize it had just been waiting to resurface. More than 10 years had passed since that day in the living room, and I had done everything I could to pretend it had never happened, to build a life untouched by it. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, and when it did, it wasn't by my doing. My dad, Harry, found a string of compromising messages on my mom's phone, late-night conversations, photos, and plans that left little room for interpretation. She couldn't deny it anymore, and when he confronted her, she admitted to multiple affairs over the years, some recent, some going back further than he wanted to believe. And then, in what I can only imagine was some twisted attempt to deflect or justify her actions, she said, "Kelly knew all along." Just like that. No warning, no care for what that might mean. She threw my silence into the center of their collapse, and in doing so, exposed everything I had tried so hard to protect. Not just from him but from myself. At the so-called family meeting, which felt more like a quiet courtroom than anything resembling reconciliation, my mother turned the tables with a calmness that made my stomach turn. She didn't cry, didn't plead, she simply said that I had known for years and had helped her keep the truth hidden, framing my silence as complicity. My dad sat across from me, shoulders slumped and eyes hollow, as if the betrayal had stretched further than he could comprehend. My brother Alex looked at me with disgust, his jaw clenched, arms folded like he was trying to keep himself from saying what he really wanted to. And Michael, the one person I thought might speak up, stayed silent, his expression unreadable, his hands folded tightly in his lap. No one asked me what had happened. No one wondered why a 12-year-old might have kept something so heavy buried. In that moment, I wasn't the child who had been threatened and manipulated, I was the adult who hadn't said anything, and that was all they could see. Michael moved out the following week, packing a single suitcase and telling me in a voice that sounded more tired than angry that he needed time to think. He couldn't understand how I had stayed silent for so many years, how I had carried something so heavy without ever trusting him enough to share it. He told me he didn't know who I really was anymore, and even though I tried to explain, tried to make him see that I had been a child when it started, that silence was never a choice but a kind of survival, he couldn't hear it, not then. He went to stay with his brother, and a few days later, I found out from a mutual friend that he had told him he wasn't sure if our marriage could survive this, that he saw too much of my mother in me now. And just like that, I was left alone, not because I had done something cruel or dishonest, but because the truth, when it finally surfaced, had come too late for anyone to separate me from the damage it revealed. We met at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee is always lukewarm and the boots are cracked from years of quiet conversations. I sat across from my dad, my hands trembling slightly as I finally told him everything. The fever, the voices, the kiss in the living room, the threats, the guilt, the silence that had followed me like a shadow through every stage of my life. I expected disbelief, maybe anger, maybe more silence. But instead, he reached across the table and took my hand in both of his grip warm and steady, and said without hesitation, "I believe you." There was something in his voice that broke me open, a kind of quiet relief I hadn't known I was waiting for. Then he took a deep breath and looked down at the table before telling me something I hadn't expected. He had always suspected. Not the details, not the depth, but something. He had seen the way she treated me, the way I changed after that year, and deep down he had known something wasn't right. He just didn't know how to ask. And somehow hearing that didn't make it all better, but it made me feel less alone. For the first time, someone who mattered had finally seen me. It wasn't until days after that meeting with my dad that the full truth started to surface, when Alex finally called me. His voice brittle, distant, not quite ready to forgive but no longer full of contempt. He told me something I never knew, something that shifted the story entirely. When he was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, he had also caught our mother with another man. Unlike me, he didn't stay silent. He told our dad, thinking it was the right thing to do, believing that the truth would protect our family. But she got to them first. She cried, denied everything, twisted the story until it sounded like a spiteful lie from a rebellious kid, and somehow convinced everyone around her that Alex had made it up. He was punished, scolded, treated like a problem child. No one believed him, not even our dad. And so, for 20 years he carried that rejection, that quiet betrayal, the pain of being cast as a liar while watching the person who hurt him pretend to be a loving mother. When he told me this, I understood the coldness in his eyes that day at the family meeting. It hadn't just been about what I didn't say, but about what he had said and how no one had listened. We had both been hurt by her in different ways, both silenced, both robbed of something we couldn't name until now. Alex apologized with a quiet sincerity that caught me off guard, and for the first time in years, we sat down together not as strangers shaped by distance, but as siblings bound by shared wounds we had both tried to forget. We talked for hours, going back through memories we had never dared to examine before, remembering how our mother played us against each other, how she rewarded silence, punished questions, and used guilt like a weapon. It was painful, but it was also healing, like peeling back layers of confusion and finally seeing the truth beneath it all. Our dad, now armed with the full picture, made the decision to file for divorce, saying he had lived too long in a lie and wasn't going to stay quiet anymore either. We're all in therapy now, each of us trying to make sense of the years we lost, of the versions of ourselves we became just to survive. And then, unexpectedly, Michael came back. He stood at my door with a look I hadn't seen in weeks, and he told me he had been wrong to walk away. He said he wouldn't let me face this alone, not anymore. For the first time in a very long time, I felt the weight begin to lift. We didn't fix everything overnight, but we had broken the cycle, and none of us were alone anymore. I have never told anyone about that day, not to my dad, not to my brother, not even to my husband, though there were countless moments when the words sat on the edge of my tongue and I swallowed them back like something poisonous. I lived with it buried in the corners of my mind, like a dirty stain I kept trying to scrub away with logic, with distance, with time. But the stain never disappeared, it just seeped deeper, became a shadow that followed me into every choice I made. It was there when I hesitated to trust, when I second-guessed myself in moments that required confidence, when I flinched at kindness because part of me believed I didn't deserve it. It shaped the way I loved, the way I protected myself, the way I learned to smile through discomfort and call it strength. And even though I told myself I had moved on, I hadn't. I had just built a life around something I never dared to name. When my father called that meeting in the living room, his voice low and serious, I thought someone had died. There was something in his tone that felt final, something that made my heart beat faster before I even entered the room. We all sat in silence, the air thick with tension, and then he looked at us, at me, at my brother, at my mother, and said the words I hadn't allowed myself to imagine out loud. My mother had been cheating on him for years. He had found the proof on her phone. Messages, photos, time-stamped lies that couldn't be explained away. I sat on the couch, barely breathing, my body rigid with the weight of a truth I had carried alone since I was 12. I felt everything around me collapse in slow motion. And then, without warning, my mother turned to me, pointed, and said coldly, "She knew. She was helping." The words hit harder than anything I'd expected, not just because they were a betrayal, but because they turned my silence into guilt in front of everyone I loved. I tried to explain, my voice shaking as I reached for the words I had buried for so long, telling them that I had been a child, that I didn't understand what I had seen, that she had threatened me, manipulated me, made me feel like the fate of our family rested on my silence. But it didn't matter. The moment had passed. The damage was already done. They weren't hearing me, they were seeing what they had just been told. My brother turned away, his jaw clenched, refusing to meet my eyes, and the distance in that small gesture felt more crushing than if he had shouted. My husband sat frozen beside me, saying nothing, his silence louder than any question, and I felt my chest tighten as I realized even he wasn't sure what to believe. And my mother, she sat there with a calm, composed face, not smug but disturbingly serene, like she had anticipated this moment all along and knew exactly how it would unfold. She didn't need to fight me. She just needed to cast the doubt and let everyone else do the rest.